from SECWAC, who will take over the introductions from here, and then we'll get started with the lecture. And I'll log into Zoom on my phone so I can manage the chat.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Nice to see everybody here, and hello, everybody online. I'm the Executive Director of Southeast Connecticut World Affairs Council, SECWAC, and I want to thank again, Chris, for this collaboration. The Great Decisions Program is something I've been meaning to get going at SECWAC for several years. Never really happened, bandwidth issues, so I'm delighted it's up and running. I have some, for those folks here in the room, I have some postcards outlining the Q2 2022 SECWAC meetings. And our next one is actually, well, there's one on April 10th at Essex Meadows. But the next formal, that's a collaboration with Essex Meadows in Essex. But on April 12th, we have Professor Marcy Shore from Yale University to speak on a similar topic, the war in Ukraine. She had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about 3 weeks ago, and I followed up with her and she agreed to speak to us. And that's actually going to be the first in-person SECWAC meeting in quite a while. It'll actually be in person and by Zoom, but mostly, hopefully, in person. So please do come to that if you have time. SECWAC is a membership organization. At this stage in the year, we'll let you join for half price. But the key to it is, and it's like $45, $47 at this stage. But the key is that you get on the mailing list, and then you get notices and reminders, and you get access to our website. We have 6 more meetings before June when we finish up for the year. So it's still worth joining. I won't go into those now because I want to get to introduce our speaker this evening, Peter Rutland. Peter is a professor of government and chair for global issues and democratic thought at Wesleyan University. He's an expert on in contemporary Russian nationalism, politics, and economy, and he studied Russia and the former Soviet Union over 3 decades. He's the author of 2 books, The Politics of Economic Stagnation in the Soviet Union and The Myth of the Plan, Lessons of Soviet Planning Experience. He's taught at Wesleyan since 1989, and before that he was at the University of Texas at Austin and the University of York and London University in the UK. He holds a BA from Oxford and a DPhil from York. He's also been a visiting professor at Columbia University and also associated with Harvard. He's also somewhat of an expert on Brexit. I know this because he actually spoke to SECWAC about 3 years ago, was it? It was pre-pandemic, yeah, because Peter is, as you'll gather very quickly from his accent, from that part of the world. He also happened to be in England in 2016 during the infamous referendum. So he gave us an insight on what was happening there. But this evening, it's very timely discussion on Putin, Russia, and the West, the path to war. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you for inviting me, and thanks for coming out. And I'll be talking about the kind of Putin's decision making tonight. So Marcy Shore, who will be speaking in a week or two, she wrote a book about the 2014 revolution in Ukraine based on interviews with Ukrainians. So I assume she'll be giving you the Ukrainian perspective. So that makes it easier for me tonight. I won't get into the Ukrainian perspective, important though it is. I'll kind of stick with the decision-making angle. So here we have 2 very, very disturbing quotes. One is the Speaker of the Russian Parliament saying there is no Russia if there is no Putin. And then we have Putin himself saying, if there's no Russia, there is no world. And you know, he repeatedly threatens to use nuclear weapons. And so that's not a kind of just an idle comment that he's making. It's a kind of serious threat. Why do we need a world without Russia in it? Why did Putin start this war? That's, you know, that's mind-blowing decision. I just couldn't believe it when I went home on the February 23rd evening and turned on the news, and at 10 o'clock, there was the missiles hitting bases in Ukraine. I just couldn't believe it because it's just too horrible to contemplate. But I knew what was going to happen. If Russia did launch that war, how brutal the Russian army is, what they did in Aleppo, what they did in Grozny. I just couldn't imagine doing that to Kiev, to Mariupol, etc. But they are. Here we are. So my main argument, before I kind of got lost in the details, is the following point: that Russia, Putin was confident at one level that Russian power was getting stronger and the US was getting weaker. That the US, the Trump presidency, the January 6th, the retreat from Afghanistan, the world seemed to be heading in Russia's way. Yet within Ukraine, on the local level, Ukraine was slipping away from Russia's control since 2014, but accelerating since Zelensky's election in 2019. So there's this gap. Putin thinks Russia's getting stronger economically and militarily at the global level, but locally in Ukraine, it's losing its grip. And so he wanted to close that gap by having a quick war. So he's not insane. It's kind of logical within his view of how the world works, that he saw this opportunity and the time was running out, that with each passing year, Ukraine was getting closer to the West, was getting more weapons, was getting stronger. And so he thought, I have to do it now, kind of thing, before the time runs out. So that's kind of my main argument. Of course, the actual war did not begin on February 24th. It began in 2014. And it's been going on for 8 years in the Donbass region, a kind of low intensity war, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 people killed every week in shelling or sniping, totaling about 14,000 deaths since 2014. Dmitry Trenin is a top Russian analyst, kind of close to the Kremlin, but independent. And so it's absolutely clear that this war has been going on for a long time. And the war is in these, in 2014, Russia seized Crimea and sparked rebellions in all of the major Russian-speaking cities of the East. And they only succeeded in seizing power in 2 of them, Donetsk and Luhansk. And the point of the war now is basically to join up the Donbass and the Crimea with this land corridor going through Mariupol to secure Russia's control over Crimea. Also, already in 2014, 2 of the main themes of the 2022 war already surfaced. This idea that Ukrainians are Nazis was already there. This is a poster from Crimea when they had a referendum to join Russia in March 2014. And the poster says, you can choose either the Nazi Crimea or the Russian Crimea. So already this rhetoric of the Ukrainians are all fascists was already in play. And Putin is kind of replaying World War II in his mind. And he plays the hero who saved Europe from fascism. Another theme that surfaced early on is threat of nuclear war. So this is Dmitry Kiselyov on one of the main Russian TV channels on the night of the referendum, telling the audience, the Americans have to remember we are a country which can reduce them to radioactive dust. And that's what the words say, into radioactive dust with the mushroom cloud. And so this is what TV is telling Russians. We're strong, we cannot be stopped, do what we want you to do, or we will kill everybody. That's what they're saying. I mean, almost verbatim. Is the war about NATO expansion? This is a common debate that it's particularly common in Chinese media, state-controlled media in China, and also in India, in democratic India, who should know better, but who are very pro-Russian in this conflict, or they did abstain at the UN. The public discussion in India is very pro-Russian. Why? Because it's anti-American. So for people in the global South and China, they see America as all powerful. America is to blame for everything. So they're to blame for the war in Ukraine as well. So it's like America's fault because America was offering NATO membership to Ukraine, although of course Ukraine was not in NATO and it was a hypothetical. Like maybe in the future, they may be able to join NATO. But that's the most common argument in much of the world as to why the war happened. And I think it's a completely fallacious argument. It's a misleading argument. Some of the context, the Soviet Union used to be all the green, and then it broke up and Russia retreated 500 or 600 miles east, right? So Russia is further back east than it's been since about 1700. So there's a huge loss of real estate and population. This was a major humiliation. Putin called it the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. And as Russia was kind of collapsing east, NATO followed east as well. And these new countries joined NATO from 1990 to 2015, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Czechoslovaks, then later on Bulgaria and Romania and the Baltic countries. So Putin saw this as a threat. Although NATO is a defensive alliance, so it's about if somebody attacks a NATO member, NATO fights back. It did conduct offensive operations in Kosovo in 1999 for humanitarian reasons, which Russia resented. But other than that, NATO is a defensive alliance. So I don't really see why Russia sees it as such a threat. Moreover, Russia's a nuclear power. So like no NATO member is going to attack Russia because they would be hit with nuclear weapons. So again, I really don't understand why Putin sees NATO as a threat. What's really going on, he just doesn't like to see those countries joining the West, not because of a security threat, just because he likes to look at that real estate and think this belongs to Russia. I'm skipping through some of the detail here. In the interest of time, we can come back to some of these issues. If it's not about NATO, it's mainly, I think, about resentment of the US as a global power. So this is payback. Putin is able to use NATO expansion and Ukraine as payback for the humiliation of the 1990s when Soviet Union collapsed, Russian economy collapsed. There was a 3-hour-long queue to get into the first McDonald's. All of that period, it produces tremendous anger in Putin and many Russians. And they blame America for all of that, even though the Soviet Union collapsed because it was just a crappy system or would have collapsed anyway. It wasn't like the US didn't engineer its collapse. It self-destructed under Gorbachev. Also, more recently, the Russians are angry at American military interventions in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Kosovo, in Libya. And I think a majority, I saw a Pew opinion poll, a majority of Americans now think that the Iraq war was a mistake, the 2003 war, 56% think it's a mistake. And so in America, we can admit our mistakes. Our government is not perfect. So I look forward to the day when Russia admits that the invasion of Ukraine is a mistake. I don't think I'll be around for that. It's going to be a long wait. And moreover, of course, the US wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were a response to 9/11. Where is the Ukrainian 9/11 on Russia? Ukraine has not attacked Russia. So nothing against Russia other than express this desire to join a hypothetical alliance. What it is about is also about Europe. The Maidan revolution in 2013 began because Ukraine was negotiating a free trade deal with the EU and then pulled out at the last minute. The pro-Russian leader decided to stick with the Russian free trade area. And so the confrontation, which led to the collapse of the pro-Russian government and then the annexation of Crimea, that was about the European Union. That wasn't about NATO. It was about a free trade area. It was about visa-free access for Ukrainians to Europe. And that's what Putin wanted to stop. Here's some data on GDP growth. The countries on the left are countries from Eastern Europe that joined the EU, and you can see that their GDP roughly doubled in the 30 years since joining the EU. Poland, for example. And on the right are countries that did not join the EU, and their GDP stagnated. Russia did okay. Russia's the one on the left because of its oil revenue, but Ukraine on the far right did particularly badly. So its GDP, real GDP, dropped by half since 1990. So its old policy of trying to bridge Europe and Russia wasn't working economically. It was working for the Ukrainian oligarchs and the Russian oligarchs who are active in Ukraine. It wasn't working for the Ukrainian people. GDP per head is about $3,000 per year. It's the poorest country in Europe, even before the war. So that's why Ukrainians wanted to join the EU or get an association agreement with the EU. There's also this identity politics dimension that Putin, in a remarkable article in July of last year, laid out an argument that Ukrainians don't exist as a nation. They're just kind of a subset of the Russians. So it was a very peculiar version of history. I think I'll skip through most of this. We can come back to it in the Q&A. It's like trying to get into where does Putin get this idea from that Ukraine doesn't exist. He's going back to the Tsars. He's going back to 19th century Tsarist Russia. And like that is the natural territory that is ruled from Moscow. And he thinks the whole Soviet experience was just a detour, a mistake. And he bizarrely blames Lenin for creating the Ukraine because Lenin made it a republic and put it as part of the Soviet Union. This is a map of where Russia was in 1700, and this is where Russia is today. The green area is Russia as it was of 1700, before they got down to the Black Sea, before they conquered Polish Lithuania. So this is the map that Putin, I imagine, has his nightmares about, that the Russia he inherited from Yeltsin and Gorbachev is the Russia before Peter the Great. They've gone back 300 years territorially. So it's his mission to push that map further out, to regain the territory that was lost in 1991. Why did Putin oppose Ukraine joining the West? It was partly economics. It was oil and gas pipelines. It was coal and iron and steel industry in East Ukraine. Mainly, I think it was the fear of democracy, the fear of the so-called color revolutions, that if Ukraine continued to be an independent, sovereign country with free elections and free speech, that would be a model which could encourage popular protests in Belarus and even Russia itself. There's also this political calculation that previously Putin had tried to manipulate Ukrainian politics to keep pro-Russian factions in the game. And Zelensky acted, especially in 2021, to cut down the power of the pro-Russian oligarchs. And he had one key figure, Vladimir Medvedchuk, arrested at the beginning of March or so. And he owned several TV stations that broadcast in Russian language, and those TV stations were closed down. So that was kind of one of the final straws for Putin, because with those pro-Russian oligarchs neutralized, his chance to influence Ukrainian politics had slipped away. Back at the beginning, I said Putin thought that the world was headed in Russia's direction. Why did he think Russia was going to be strong enough to pull off invading an entire country, a country the size of France with 44 million people in it? Why did he think he could pull this off and not be held to account by the West? Well, partly it's economics, that Russia supplies 40% of Europe's natural gas and 25% of its oil. And he just thought they can't possibly afford just to try and stop me, because they'll be sitting in frozen buildings and their industry will shut down because they won't have any energy. So he thought that he had the West over a barrel. This is not such a problem for the US because we don't import almost any oil from Russia. It's like 5 or 6% of the US oil imports from Russia, but it's a huge problem for Europe. Also, the geopolitics with Biden coming in, wanting to focus on rebuilding the American economy, and China. Also, Angela Merkel stepped down in Germany after 16 years. So the geopolitics seemed to favor Russia. And then it had 3 successful, in Putin's mind, small wars that he conducted in Georgia, Crimea 2014, and Syria. And Russia kind of won all 3 of those. And so he's thinking, I'm on a roll here. This is going to be no problem. And if he really believed his own historical revisionism, if he really believed that Ukrainians don't exist as a nation, then there would be no resistance. Then they would welcome the Russians coming and helping them out. So he probably really believed that, because it's such a dumb decision otherwise, that he must actually have believed his own propaganda, his own historical theory that denied that Ukrainians have an independent identity. And now we know 1 month after the war began, we know that's not true. I think I'll skip through these. Well, these are more about internal trends within Ukraine. I mentioned already the arrest of Viktor Medvedchuk. Another crucial development was the increased flow of weapons from the West, from the US, to Ukraine in the last couple of years. For example, in 2020, Azerbaijan attacked the rebel enclave of Karabakh, the Armenian enclave, and conquered most of it. And they used Turkish drones to devastate the Armenian artillery and tanks. And Ukraine bought 20 of those Bayraktar Turkish drones and used one of them in November 21 to destroy a Russian artillery piece in Donbass. So this was like bad news for Russia. Also, we have these anti-tank missiles that started to be provided to Ukraine, which we've seen used very effectively, which neutralized the massive 1,000-tank army that Russia was ready to pour into Ukraine. So these changes in the military strength of Ukraine were disturbing to Putin. I already talked about those, I think. Yeah, I'll skip that one. I'm trying to skip through the more academic parts and go to the Q&A. Yeah, this is one argument, apart from NATO expansion, another argument which we often hear, which I think is misleading, is the diversionary politics argument. The reason Putin launched this war was because he was worried about getting reelected. He was worried about declining popularity in opinion polls. So this is a very common argument. This is an argument that applies often to leaders in democratic countries. The diversionary argument, the rally around the flag argument, worked for Margaret Thatcher in the Falklands War, which happened just 30 years ago last week. Helped her win re-election. But Putin is not in a democracy. Dictators don't care about winning the next election. They know what the results are already. So I don't really think that he was worried about boosting his approval ratings. It's true that his approval shot up 20% after the annexation of Crimea back in 2014. So he went from 60% approval to 85% approval within a month. That's true, but that was ex post. He didn't invade Crimea in order to boost his approval rating. He didn't know what happened to his approval rating if he invaded Crimea. Only afterwards, oh, it went up, that's great. But there was no killing in Crimea. It was a fait accompli. It was clean. So you can't extrapolate from that to 2022, I would suggest. Whole question of sanctions is also part of the story. And the West did sanction Putin after the annexation of Crimea, but the sanctions were targeted on certain oligarchs and government officials and certain sectors like oil and gas technology companies. But they were limited in scope, and they knocked 1% per annum off the Russian GDP growth, but it didn't change Putin's behavior. And so he thought, whatever sanctions the West throw at me, it's not going to be a problem. Remember, the Europeans are buying over $100 billion of oil and gas every year, and they can't get it anywhere else. So that's my war chest. It's a constant flow of money. You know, it's about $800 million a day coming to Russia from its energy exports. Over the years, he built up this war chest of $640 billion in foreign assets and gold. But he was caught by surprise in 2022 by the speed of the sanctions that were planned in advance because the US saw the invasion coming, so got the Europeans lined up. By the number of countries that joined the sanctions, 48 countries, including Switzerland, which very rarely gets involved in this neutral country. They've joined the bank sanctions, and Taiwan, which is an important source of microchips. And Russia doesn't produce any of its own microchips, except very 15-year-old ones. So they need Taiwanese microchips for all of their military hardware and for their cars and their TVs and whatever else microchips go into these days. So that's going to be a problem. They'll have to buy them through back channels, through China, and sanctions can be avoided, but it costs time and money. So the big surprise was the freezing of the central bank's assets. That had been done before to Iran and Venezuela, I think, but nobody talked about that being done to Russia. So I think the Russians didn't see that coming. If they had, they would have moved more of their assets out of New York, London, and Basel. But somewhere between a half and 2/3 of the central bank's assets are frozen, and they can't get at that money, which is a problem for them. However, given that they got that revenue stream from the oil and gas, they can use that oil and gas money to meet their international debt obligations. That's enough money to do that and to rebuild the military. So I'm not terribly optimistic about the impact of the sanctions in terms of changing Putin's behavior, but it's definitely adding to the costs of his decision to go to war. So he's not getting away scot-free kind of thing. Putin he's a long-term thinker. So he's probably thinking that the West will fragment, that the Europeans will kind of give up on the sanctions, and in a few months, 6 months, a year, the sanctions regime will kind of fritter away. So that's probably what he's planning on. This is just a little sheet of the top richest 20 oligarchs, and the little flags at the top show you which countries have sanctioned them: the EU, the US, and the UK. So most of these guys got off without sanctions after 2014. But as you'll know from reading the papers about yachts being seized in various Italian ports, there's been a really serious effort to go after the oligarchs and their families, and to freeze their assets and shut off their bank accounts. And this has been damaging the wealth and presumably vacation plans of the Russian billionaires. But will that change Putin's mind? No. Putin doesn't care about, okay, he has a $700 million yacht. He doesn't care about that yacht. He doesn't care about the oligarchs' yachts. He cares about his place in Russian history. In the hall where he meets the Security Council, there are the statues of 4 Tsars: Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Alexander I, and Nicholas I. And Putin wants to be, the fifth statue in there. That's what he cares about, I think. Okay. This debate, so what is the point of the sanctions then? The 2014 sanctions, the theory was, if we hit these oligarchs, they'll go to Putin and say, stop doing it. And he'll say, okay, we'll withdraw from Crimea. That didn't work. The blanket sanctions, maybe the idea is to provoke a coup or popular unrest and remove Putin. But I think few people believe that's going to happen because the security regime has been preparing for this for 10 years. The control of the media, the censorship of the internet, the persecution of the opposition. Now it all makes sense. Kind of looking back, you wonder, why are they trying to poison Navalny? Okay, he was vaguely annoying, but he wasn't going to take power from Putin. Why go after him so ruthlessly? Now I understand why. It's because Navalny could have rallied anti-war protests. He could have become the voice of people who think this is an outrageous war. So you've got to get him out of the way before you launch the war. So that makes sense. So here was this rally at the football stadium in Moscow a couple of weeks ago. So Putin is trying to whip up popular support. So he's standing there in what apparently is a $15,000 Italian puffy jacket, designer puffy jacket. And these rallies seem to be working. So the sad thing is that brainwashing propaganda works. The majority of Russians support the war. Officially, it's not called a war. You can get up to 15 years in jail if you call it a war. Officially, it's a special military operation. But whatever it is, most Russians seem to support it. There are opinion polls that confirm that, and even anecdotal evidence of people phoning up relatives and friends in Russia, people from Ukraine phoning up their grandparents in Russia and saying, we're being bombed. And the grandparents say, no, you're not. You know, that's fake news. That's CNN propaganda. Is there a risk of escalation to nuclear war? As I said, Putin has repeatedly threatened nuclear war. It is Russian policy to use nuclear weapons first if Russia's existence is threatened. And Putin's July essay seemed to suggest that the very existence of Ukraine was a threat to Russian existence. So he's given himself carte blanche to decide anything is a threat. So this is very alarming. And that's why the point at the bottom there of the US from the beginning saying we're not going to put troops into Ukraine, we're not going to do a no-fly zone. That's because we don't want to push him over that edge of getting first use of nuclear weapons. So I'm afraid my attitude towards Russia, I've been studying the place for actually 40 years, not 30 years. And I love Russia, I love Russians, I love going there, even like food, I like everything about it. But it's got a horrible political regime, it's got a horrible history. And I thought that history had been put to bed. And it's back. I feel like I'm back where I was when I was a 20-year-old student deciding what to study and worried about nuclear war. Thinking, okay, let's study the Soviet Union. And I thought the Soviet Union had gone in 1991, and it's back. And what Putin is doing in Ukraine is perhaps worse than anything the Brezhnev regime did. The death toll, the brutality, it's on the same scale as the invasion of Afghanistan, but it's much more concentrated. It's like only been 5 weeks. So this is very, very disturbing, and I'm afraid I don't see an easy off-ramp. That Putin will continue, I think, the war effort to grab as much territory in Ukraine as he can, to expel the population, the civilian population from those territories, and to form this new Russia, Novorossiya, linking up Russia, Donbass, and Crimea. At the beginning, he wanted to take over the whole country, you know, to decapitate. That was the word they used. The Putin's regime used, decapitate the government and take over the whole Ukraine. I think he's given up on that. He would like to take Odessa and take the whole Black Sea. He's probably given up on that, but he's not given up on territorial expansion. And the many Russian officials repeatedly say, defeat is not an option. The only option is victory. That's the minimum that we will accept, is victory on our terms. But that's kind of repeated mantra. I think I'm done. Yeah, I think I'll stop there and invite Q&A. I think I covered the main points, and Yes, gentleman in the back.
So some people are suggesting that if there is an out or an off-ramp, as you say, it would be a slice of land somewhere in the east, in the Donbass area. If there was a referendum of the civilian population living there prior to this war, how would those people have voted?
Well, you know, the Donetsk and Luhansk are two provinces in the east, and the separatists control about a third of the territory. So they don't control the whole of those two territories. They control a section of the two territories, which at the beginning had about 3.5 million people in it. And it's about 50% bigger than Connecticut. So it's a roughly Connecticut-ish sized chunk. And so that territory has been under Russian control since 2014. And, you know, they did have a referendum in Crimea in 2014, and a vast majority voted in favor of joining Russia. And that was rigged, but probably a majority of the Crimeans probably would have voted in favor of joining Russia. Crimea was the only Ukrainian province that was majority ethnic Russian. But in Donbass, it's harder to say. And I think the polls that were done, that most of the Donbass residents did not want to join Russia back in 2014. They wanted like autonomy within Ukraine or something, but only a minority wanted to join Russia. And over time, a lot of people fled, you know, about 2 million people fled from Donbass because there was no economy there, and you know, it was criminal gangs running it. It was a very unpleasant place. Some of them went to Ukraine, some of them went to Russia. So when you say I have a referendum, you know, what population do the dead people in Mariupol get to vote? You know, Mariupol was a town of 400,000 people, right? 300,000 have fled now. Do they get to vote? You know, tens of thousands probably are dead under the rubble. They don't get to vote. So the whole notion of a referendum in the middle of a war just doesn't make any sense, kind of thing. So it'll be decided on the battlefield how far the Russians can go. And then they'll organize fake referenda like they did in Donbass, like they did in the Baltic countries in 1940, you know, when the Baltic countries joined the Soviet Union. And they'll declare people's republics or whatever, you know. So I think the evidence is pretty clear that most Ukrainians wanted to live in Ukraine as a sovereign state. They did not want to secede and join Russia. Russia's a richer country, but it's also a police state with less freedom. And if you're a Ukrainian, do you want your son to go and be drafted into the Russian army and end up fighting somewhere in Syria, whatever, Mali, you name it? You know, so I think there are a lot of reasons why Russian-speaking Ukrainians did not want to secede and join Russia. And now with the atrocities following the invasion, I think the pro-Russian sentiments in Ukraine have shrunk. They haven't disappeared completely. There will be some people who support the Russian occupation forces, just like there was in France, you know, Vichy regime, or the Quislings in Norway. There will be some people who accept the new powers that be and adjust their identity accordingly. And we know how history has treated those folks. Not very well. But that will play out in next weeks and months. Yeah.
So I'm catching up on Ukraine. I was surprised the graph you showed that Ukraine's GDP growth was the worst in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And because what you hear is breadbasket, huge reserves of natural gas. So why is their economy so poor? Is it corruption or why?
Yeah, it's corruption. It's mismanagement. Yeah, I mean, they've got very powerful local and regional oligarchs. You know, there's probably a dozen billionaires out of Ukraine, people with assets of more than $1 billion. So there were people making money in various parts of the economy, but all of that money was salted overseas. Very little of it was reinvested in Ukraine. And the politicians were bought off to cover up that state of affairs, right? So it was similar to what was happening in Russia, whereas Russia, they got 100 billionaires, as opposed to Ukraine with 10. But in Russia, what happened is that Putin comes in 2000 and wrenches political control back from the oligarchs, taxes them a bit, but Russia's also much wealthier because of the oil and gas. Putin gets back control of the oil and gas industry. Most of it is like renationalized. And so most of the revenues from oil and gas are going into the pockets of the Russian state, with some of it going into the pockets of Putin's cronies. So that central political power in Russia never existed in Ukraine. There was never that kind of central authority that was able to rein in the oligarchs and tax them a little bit. That never happened. So it remained very decentralized. And Ukraine does have potential natural gas, but they're not pumping any right now. They have coal certainly, the agriculture. I think Russia exports 20% of the global grain market, and the Ukraine are 10%. So it does have tremendous potential economically, and some people got very wealthy in Ukraine, but the ordinary people weren't seeing any of that. So, and all of the Western efforts to try and reboot the economic reforms didn't really go very far. So that's been the way for 30 years, 25, 30 years. Many Ukrainians left to work abroad. Some of them would have gone to Russia before 2014. Most of them would have gone to Russia, and then over time, more of them were going to the EU, and especially after they got visa-free travel to the EU. And so there was probably a couple of million Ukrainians working mainly in Poland before the war. And so that was where the economy was. Yeah.
When we were talking about the 2014 Ukraine pulled out of an opportunity to be part of the EU trade zone, can you explain a little bit more fully how that led to the pro-Russian Ukrainian government switching?
Yeah, so what happened was the first revolution was back in 2004 when there was a two-term president, Leonid Kuchma, who was quite pro-Russian. He reached the end of his second term. He couldn't go on for a third term. So he picked a successor called Viktor Yanukovych, who was pro-Russian Party of Regions from the Donetsk, Russian speaker. And he got elected, but the election was rigged. And people protested on the streets. This is like November, December 2004. And under tremendous international pressure, the Kuchma agreed not to repress the protesters, to rerun the election with international monitors. So the election was rerun, and Yanukovych lost and Yushchenko won. So that was the color revolution, the orange revolution. And Yushchenko was a pro-Russian, pro-Western leader who wanted to do more market reform and so on. So that was the first round in 2004. But nothing much happened under Yushchenko. There was a lot of corruption and splits, and people were dissatisfied. And then 2010 rolls around, and there's an election for the president, and the Yanukovych wins. A free and fair election, and he's the pro-Russian candidate from the East, and he won in 2010. And he starts negotiating with Russia for more economic aid, but also negotiating with the EU for economic aid from the EU. So he has a kind of bidding war going on. And the EU is keen to offer economic cooperation with Ukraine. So they put together this free trade deal, also some development aid. And it's a pretty attractive package. And at the last minute, Yanukovych pulls out of the deal because Putin offers him $15 billion loan. So it's like Yanukovych walks away from the Europeans and agrees to go with Moscow. And that decision in November 2013 again led to protests. So the pro-Western protesters took to the streets and started camping out on the Maidan Square in Kiev in November. And that goes on for 2 or 3 months. The protesters are sitting there. The police sometimes come in and beat them up and even kidnap and kill some opposition leaders. So the anger mounts. And it all boils over in February 2014 when the shooting, 100 protesters are killed, 15 police are killed, and then the protesters storm the parliament building and Yanukovych flees the country. So that's the Maidan Revolution 2014 version. And so Yanukovych flees to Moscow. So the Moscow deal is off, and then the EU comes in and offers the association agreement. And then in retaliation, Moscow annexes Crimea and starts these rebellions in the east. So the EU didn't see all that coming, right? So the EU doesn't have a military arm. It's not a military alliance, doesn't have its own army. They're just thinking in terms of economics and freedom of movement and that kind of thing. So they were kind of blindsided by the fact that Putin would retaliate by using military force. So yeah, that was that. Yeah.
I've seen on the news that some middle-class Russians are leaving the country, anticipating economic hardship in the near future. What do you think the impact of that would be on Russia, if any, say over the next couple of years?
Yeah, it's very sad, that because Russia was a free society until recently. I mean, the internet was free. The internet, there was some censorship creeping on extremists, but you had basically free access to the internet. YouTube was there, Netflix, whatever, So it was Russians could come and go as they pleased. So it was on a day-to-day basis a free society. If you didn't worry too much about the fact that you can't really influence the government through elections, you could live your life and build a good life. And then gradually under Putin, the zone of freedom shrank, and in the last 6 weeks, it shrunk even more. So now, police are stopping young people on the street and looking at, give me your phone, looking at your phone and looking at your social media and seeing if you're on anti-Russian Telegram channels, if you're criticizing the war, and then you can be arrested for that. So just the level of police surveillance has gone through the roof. It's not just anybody who tries to protest is immediately arrested. They're acting proactively, and in many universities, there were like 500 university rectors, a couple of whom I know personally, were forced to sign a letter saying we support the special military operation in Ukraine. And if you didn't sign, you would be immediately fired. So, and the same thing is going on at the school level. The children are denouncing teachers because the teachers said something critical, the war is horrible or something. It's pervade every level of society. And the teachers are being forced to teach classes about the genocide in Donbass that the Ukrainians were doing before the war. The direct instructions, you have to organize these lessons now, everybody. So all of that is very shocking. I mean, that didn't exist even in Putin's Russia. There wasn't that level. It was getting there. It was kind of creeping up, but it hadn't reached that level of intensity. And so that's why people are leaving. Estimates vary, 70,000, 200,000. So a lot of people are leaving, and a lot of them, it's the young, it's the highly educated, it's the IT people, they just moved the whole company to Tbilisi, Georgia, and they can do all of what they were doing, most of what they were doing, because it's all online, they can do it in Georgia or in Latvia. Even somebody told me of a family just moved from Moscow to Uzbekistan. Now, if you're moving to Uzbekistan's nice enough place, nothing against Uzbekistan, but if you are moving to Uzbekistan for freedom, that's not a good sign for Russia. That is not a good sign for Russia. So that was, they can't get out to many places. There are very few flights available. Finland just closed off the railway link. You can fly to Serbia, but the flights are all booked up and it's like $5,000 a one-way ticket. You can fly to Turkey, but there are some places like Georgia and Uzbekistan where you don't need visas if you're a Russian. So you can go there.
Uzbekistan, where the Russians sent some troops to put down a popular rebellion.
That was Kazakhstan. Yeah. Yeah, this is all the same thing happened after the Russian Revolution. Back in 1920, a lot of the middle class intellectuals, not to mention the aristocracy, they just left, right? Because they saw they had no future. So the whole, the hundreds of thousands went to China, the white Russians of Harbin. They went to Paris and they became janitors in Paris. You had counts, barons driving taxis or whatever. So we're kind of experiencing that kind of thing happening again, which is just unbelievable. I mean, just it's very hard to swallow that.
Yeah.
That's happening. Yes, sir.
Yes, Putin was a student of Stalin and a lifelong member of the KGB. And I think for decades, people just figured at an opportune time, Putin was going to do something similar to what following Stalin's policies. And so all of this doesn't seem to be a surprise. It was just a matter of the right opportunity because it was going to happen sometime or other. And even all the speculation about Russia's not going to stop here for those same reasons. So I'd like to comment on that. But the second is, with regard to Crimea, Russia was in desperate need of a warm water port, and Crimea was the golden opportunity. And so it was believed that that was the primary reason they took over Crimea. Your comment on that?
Yeah, because when the Soviet Union broke up, the Soviet fleet in the Black Sea was based at Sevastopol in Crimea. That's the only deep water port in the whole Black Sea Russian coastline. They have a couple of other ports, but they're not deep water. They have to, piers going out to the ships kind of thing. So they really needed Sevastopol for the fleet. And so they made a deal with Ukraine that was 1997, 25-year lease they got on the Sevastopol port. So they had the Navy there, the Russian Navy, with 25,000 troops were permanently based there. And and then when Yanukovych became president in 2010, he lengthened the lease. He gave them like a 40-year lease. So they were already in Sevastopol. But then when the Maidan 2014 revolution happened, I guess Putin was afraid that if the pro-Western forces take power, they might kick Russia out of the naval base. So that was kind of his reasoning, I suppose, for wanting to annex Crimea, or one of the reasons. But I agree. I think he does think very much in terms of geopolitics and security. And so, yes, the Sevastopol base was critical. On the question of should we have seen this coming, and should we have expected it? And yes, in retrospect, yes. I didn't see it coming. I just couldn't believe that he would do that. So I was wrong, but I also didn't see the collapse of the Soviet Union. I actually lost a $5 bet with my history department colleague about whether the Communist Party would still be in power in 3 years' time in 1989. So yes, I was guilty of wishful thinking because I knew that Putin had done horrible things. The war in Chechnya, the second war in Chechnya, the poisoning of Navalny, the poisoning of the Skripals in Britain, the polonium poisoning of Litvinenko in Britain. So I had no illusions about Putin being ruthless. But still, to launch a war across an international boundary on a country that's done nothing to you, which violates all of the norms of the past 50, 60, 70 years, whatever it is, 75 years of history. Right? I mean, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, there was already a pro-communist presence in Afghanistan. When they occupied Budapest in '56, that was A, it was only 10 years after World War II, and the Hungarians had been on the other side, and B, they still had Soviet troops just withdrawn from Austria. So there were all kinds of geopolitical reasons for them being there already. Likewise, the invasion of Czechoslovakia in '68, it was already part of the Warsaw Pact. So those military interventions by the Soviet Union, despicable though they were kind of within the rules of the game, that Stalin had drawn that line in Europe, this is our half and you keep out of it. And he used the military within the agreed rules of the game kind of thing. And Putin's invasion of Crimea was not part of anybody's rules of the game. You know, it was a complete violation of international law, and it's just so contradictory because one of Putin's arguments is that the Ukrainians are our Russian brothers. They just don't realize that they're our Russian brothers. So he's launching this war, which is turning into a nearly genocidal war with mass killings of people who he sees as his brothers. So it's fratricidal, which adds another kind of layer of disbelief for me. That why is he doing this? It's very, very. So even though I admit that the signs were there, that we could see he was preparing this, and it's a kind of a logical progression from everything he's done. We can see now it's leading up to this. But I still defend my argument that we shouldn't be. We shouldn't always expect the worst. Then we'll for sure get the worst. I still believe that we should have an optimistic side of history. That yeah, Russia could go this way or could go that way, and let's try and make sure it goes this way, kind of thing. Maybe that's naive, but that's where I was coming from. Yeah.
I do have a question from the chat. It's from Tracy McKee. Finland is considering joining NATO. How might Putin react to that?
Yeah, he definitely won't be happy with that. And Finland, there's been a lot of discussion. I think that's one of the slides I kind of skipped over was the neutrality debate. The Ukrainian president has now kind of officially given up on NATO membership and said we're willing to renounce NATO membership, which probably would have been a good thing to do 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but we'll never know if that would have been enough to satisfy Putin. So now the debate is what does neutrality mean for Ukraine? And because Finland is neutral, Austria is neutral, Switzerland is neutral, and a couple of issues there are it's what they call armed neutrality. So Finland and Switzerland and Sweden, they do have armies. Actually, they spend more on the military and they have conscription. They just reintroduced conscription in Sweden in 2018, and they never gave it up in Switzerland, I don't think. So the armed neutrality does not mean you're demilitarized. So that's a problem because Putin is saying Ukraine has to be demilitarized, whatever that means. That means like having Russian occupation forces, making sure there are no heavy weapons there. You know, that's kind of, you've got to clear that up in the negotiation. Finland does not have any Russian monitors on its territory, right? Finland is able to arm itself and have this armed neutrality. So would Putin be willing to see Ukraine like Finland? And then secondly, there's the question of international guarantees that the neutrality of places like Switzerland and Sweden is embedded in international treaties. And so Ukraine would want more guarantees from other countries of its neutrality. Now, they had some limited guarantees of their sovereignty under the so-called Budapest Memorandum of 1994, which was an agreement between the UK, US, Russia, and Ukraine, where in return for giving up its nuclear weapons, Ukraine got these security assurances, assuring its territorial integrity and sovereignty. But that was not an international treaty. It wasn't ratified by parliaments, and the word guarantee wasn't used, only assurances. And we see what that's worth now. It's worth nothing, right? So next time around, Ukraine would want more robust international treaties guaranteeing its sovereignty. And I think it would like to see places like Turkey and China signing those documents. Again, we don't know if Putin is going to go along with that. And if Finland joined NATO, would Putin do anything? He'd move more nuclear missiles into Kaliningrad or something to threaten Finland, but would he want to invade Finland? I don't think so. We're talking about Stalin. Stalin invaded Finland. That didn't go very well for Stalin in 1939. The Finns fought the Russians to a standstill, kind of, a bit like what the Ukrainians are doing now. And so Stalin he did take 20% of Finland's territory into Russia, Karelia, but he recognized the independence of Finland. And so that could be what's going to happen to Ukraine. They'll lose 20% of their territory and they'll have to be neutral, but then Russia will leave them alone. That would be not a pleasant outcome, but it might be the least worst outcome that we can expect.
We do have one other person on Zoom. Ellen, I don't know if you can hear me. Ellen, if you want to just unmute, you can ask your question. We should be able to hear you.
Yes, can you hear me?
I can, but nobody else can.
Yeah, it's not coming through this microphone.
Okay. I do have a couple of questions and more for your opinion, I guess. One of them is, do you think that if the sanctions that have been frittered out, so to speak, one sanction after another over a period of time, do you think if all those sanctions had been done prior or just after the war started would have made a difference to Putin? Hello? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Sorry, try it again. This is the mic.
So the sanctions were the freezing of the central bank was wheeled out on the Monday. The invasion started on the Thursday. So they had that one prepared, and many of the other bank sanctions were also hit very quickly. And so the things they've been doing since then are adding more banks to the list, because they left some banks off the sanctions so they could handle the oil and gas sales to Europe. And so they've incrementally been adding more names to the oligarchs list, but the bulk of the important sanctions were done within a week or so. So I think it was really pretty effective diplomacy that the Europeans and Americans and Canadians and so on put those sanctions in place. The basic problem is that oil and gas revenue. That's the problem, that you cannot cut off Europe from the Russian oil and gas, except a tremendous cost to Europe. And even if Europe decided tomorrow, okay, we're not going to buy any more Russian oil and gas, which they would have a tremendous burden on the German economy in particular. Even if they did that, Russia would still be able to sell all of the tanker-based oil and liquefied gas to China and India, who are happily buying Russian tanker oil and gas. So the only revenue stream that would be halted is the pipeline oil and the pipeline gas. So that would damage Russia, but you know, the oil price has spiked, as we all know. So if the oil price has gone from, you know, $70 a barrel to $120 a barrel, that's a lot of increased revenue for Russia. So even if their volume falls 50%, the price has gone up 50%, so they're still getting the same amount of money. And so there's basically that's the main factor limiting the effectiveness of sanctions. So the other stuff makes life uncomfortable for the oligarchs, the middle class, and also in the long run, it makes it difficult for Russian industry because they're going to have very little foreign investment. They're going to have real problems getting in foreign equipment, even things like, you know, that all their airlines are closed down because the European airspace is blocked to them. They got 550 leased planes, and the leasers are all in the West, and they want those planes back. And so as soon as those planes show up anywhere, they're going to be impounded because they can't pay the lease because they can't get the money released. Right? Plus, there's the spare parts problem. They're not getting any spare parts from Airbus or Boeing. They're not getting any software updates. And that applies to a whole slew of industrial machinery. Right? So they're going to have huge problems running their industry, most of which was using Western technology or Japanese technology or Taiwanese technology. And that's all stopped. So that they're going to find ways around it by getting Chinese companies to buy it for them, you know, but then they have to pay more, right? Because the Chinese are going to rip you off because they know, you know, this is, you know, sanctions busting costs money. And there's a risk to the Chinese companies because the US is applying secondary sanctions to companies that break first sanctions. So Chinese companies that even big, you know, big companies like Huawei or whatever, they're not willing to like openly break the sanctions because then they get shut out of the American market. And the American, you know, Chinese business with Russia is $140–50 billion a year, imports and exports. But to the US, it's 10 times more, right? It's $1.1 trillion of China trade with the US. So the Chinese are not going to jeopardize further the trade with the US by being too blatant in the sanctions evading with Russia. So I think Russian business people, they're not having a good year, let's put it that way. They're in deep trouble. Do you have a second? Sorry, do you have a second question as well, or was that it?
No, I'm all set. Thank you very much.
Right.
The American media, to their credit, have made this the dominant story. However, it seems that the coverage that we're seeing is either in Poland with refugees, or it's with people in Lviv, which is an area that really isn't being attacked. Mm-hmm. And even though we see some of the American news people wearing you know, bulletproof vests and helmets, they're getting to the sites where the damage was done after the fact. Mm-hmm. And we don't get a real good sense on what's happening on the day-to-day combat, and we don't get a sense on whether the Russian troops are demoralized. We keep hearing that they're inept and demoralized, but is that the case?
Yeah, it's true that the Western media are clustered in certain places. On the other hand, they flooded Ukraine. There's a lot of journalists in Ukraine, and some of them have been getting to the front lines. And I think there's been 6 or 7 journalists killed already, mostly Ukrainians, not all. So the journalists are doing a great job, I think, in trying to report this war. And then you have all the cell phone stuff coming out from the front lines, and you have drone videos. So there's huge volume of information. I mean, there's never been a war before. I think it's just fair to say that it's had so much information about what's happening coming out in real time. Right? So it's really overwhelming amount of information. And there's a website called Oryx, for example, that pulls images of destroyed Russian vehicles off the web and geolocates them and confirms them and puts them up. So you can log in and you can see with the photos there how many tanks has been destroyed or captured, you know, only the video, only the images. There are other ones that haven't been photographed that we don't know about, but they've logged, I think it's now up close to 2,000 vehicles that they've logged, you know, and that's a private hacker network or whatever. It's not a government doing that. So, and there are multiple examples of this, and there are reports now of the atrocities like the Bucha and Troyanets. I just read this morning that Tchaikovsky's house was in Troyanets, which is near Sumy on the northern border, and it was destroyed in Russian shelling. The house where the 24-year-old Tchaikovsky wrote his first work, overture called Storm. That house is gone. So, and there are videos, again, another very unpleasant video. You've seen probably on the CNN a couple of days ago, the videos of the civilians with the hands tied behind the back in the street in Bucha, and the mayor of Troyanets was killed with her husband and son, hands tied behind the back in a grave. You know, so there's videos like that, but also today I saw a video of Ukrainian soldiers killing Russian wounded on the road, not far from Bucha. I'm proud of it and saying to the camera, this is what's going to happen to all of you if you come on our land. So this, I'm sure you're right that there's a lot of things happening that we're not seeing, and we don't know. We don't know what happened to the 300 people in the basement of the Mariupol theater. Presumably they're all dead. You know, maybe there's 500 there, maybe there's 50. We don't know right yet. So there's a lot of stories that will remain untold for the time being, but still just the volume of information we've got, some of it fake probably, some of it missing, you know, and the Ukrainian government is doing what any government does in a war. They're curating the news, right? They're doing what the American media and British media did in World War II. If you're at war, you don't care about telling the truth. You want your side to win, right? That's completely understandable. Yes, there's a lot of skewed information floating around, but I think we can tell the general picture about what is happening. You know, the Mariupol is not a movie set, as the Russians would imply, with crisis actors pretending to be war casualties. You know, there's a truth out there and reality out there, and I think we're getting a lot of it thanks to the media. And you know, that wasn't true in World War II. If you think about the Holocaust, how long it took for the Western leaders to kind of really get a sense of what was happening. It was very, very difficult to get information out in World War II media. So that this is very different now.
Do you also think maybe one of Putin's thoughts is worldwide economic hardship, or am I giving him too much credit?
Well, he is to some extent playing up the collateral damage to the global economy, you know, because the fuel prices, the fertilizer, Russia is a big fertilizer exporter, and also high fuel prices push up the price of fertilizer. So that's hitting farmers everywhere. You know, fertilizer is 50% more expensive than it was 6 months ago, and it's going to go up even more. So farmers already are just not able to buy fertilizer for the next harvest. And then on top of that, you've got the cutting off of 30% of the world's grain supplies, because the Russian grain can't get out either from the Black Sea, because the Russians sank a Portuguese, no Panamanian ship, you know, a merchant ship. So no commercial vessels can go anywhere to Odessa or to a Russian port to bring out the grain. Right? And they just don't have the railway capacity to export that grain anywhere else, to China. I mean, they just don't have, you know, just the infrastructure to relocate all those exports. Some of them maybe, but so the international food prices are going to skyrocket over the next year. You know, this is not just a problem right this week. This is a problem for the whole growing season into the next year. So that's going to be mass starvation in Sudan, Ethiopia, Afghanistan. It's going to get much worse because the food price is going to be pick a number, you know, 30% higher or whatever. And so that means poor people will be eating 30% less, right? Because they're spending all their money on food. So that's not, you know, Putin didn't intend that to happen because he thought this would be over in a week. But it's another argument he's using, and again, he can blame the West. You know, this is Biden's war. Biden started this war. Biden is punishing the world. Why is Biden punishing the world? This is the Russian propaganda media. And so there was Lenin, although Putin doesn't like Lenin, and he's behaving a lot like Lenin, and one of Lenin's slogans was "the worse, the better." You know, like the crisis of capitalism, the worse it gets, the better for us, because the capitalism will collapse. So, you know, the more desperate the situation of the Russian army at the front, the better for us. So there's some of that in Putin, I think. But, costs and benefits.
One more question probably, and then we should wrap it up.
Okay.
Go ahead.
We talked a little bit about how Ukraine gave up their nuclear capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Do we see everything that's happening now making the world in general more reluctant to give up their own nuclear capabilities?
Yeah, that's another very disturbing, you know, this has shockwaves that affect lots of different areas. And one of them is that idea of nuclear non-proliferation. They're trying to stop other countries acquiring nuclear weapons, which has been very difficult. So, you know, Pakistan, India, North Korea, Iran is trying, you know, so all of that decades-long effort, which Russia kind of supported, you know, to try and stop the spread of nuclear weapons, that's been undermined now because, like, as you say, well, if Ukraine had had nuclear weapons of its own, this wouldn't have happened. That's the hypothesis, right? That if they'd had the capacity to strike back with nuclear weapons, maybe Putin wouldn't have invaded them. But the reality is that the nuclear arsenal that was on Ukraine wasn't actually Ukrainian. It was kind of still controlled by the Soviet army people. So it's not clear whether Ukraine ever really was a nuclear power to begin with. I mean, the missiles were based there, but I think the actual command and control was still run out of Moscow. You know, so it's not like they had their own nuclear deterrent and then gave it up exactly. It was more. But the US was very keen on pushing that through, that we didn't want Ukraine to become a nuclear power. So the US kind of arm twisted. The Ukrainian government was agreeable, but the Ukrainian parliament was resisting, and they really had to put pressure, this is back in '94, on the Ukrainian parliament to agree to give up the missiles.
Okay, well, listen, Peter, thanks very much for coming the whole way here today and sharing your knowledge and taking all the Q&A. For those of you who are not SECWAC members, I'm going to make an executive decision and extend an invitation, a free visit next Tuesday on April 12th to another talk on Ukraine. It'll be at the First Congregational Church in Old-Lyme. If you turn up in person, say you're part of the Great Decisions program. But we do hope that you'll think about joining SECWAC, because this is the kind of subject we cover. And you'll see on this, for those of you here in the room, from your postcard, you'll see the topics we have coming up. It makes me think we'll have to have you, Peter, come to SECWAC for a regular meeting, maybe 6 or 9 months from now, maybe in the fall or this time next year. Hopefully, we'll be moved on to better times, but who knows?
Talk about Britain joining the European Union.
You can come and talk about Britain joining the European Union. Yes, well, we'll have to. have a beer over that one. Okay, thanks very much. If you could all give him a round of applause. Thank you.